Hello and welcome to Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. My name is Ciaran Conliffe, and I'm here today to ask you a question. What is Irish history? Or more broadly, what is history itself? Is it the exact recounting of events that happened in the past? Or is it the stories we tell ourselves about what happened in years gone by? Are the myths of Cuchulainn and Finn McCool as much a part of our history as the martyrdom of Patrick Pearse? Personally, I think that they are. Even if they didn't happen, they still shape our present and our national character. What if a myth wasn't really a myth, but a fake invention? If it still left an impact on our heritage and how we see ourselves, does that still make it part of our history? It's that exact situation I want to talk about today. A glorious myth cycle of Gaelic heroism that took Europe by storm in the 18th century. The Ossian saga tells of the invasion of Ireland by a Scandinavian army and the arrival of their Scottish kinsmen to save them. Originally translated into English by James McPherson, they were published in multiple languages and spread an appreciation of Gaelic culture around the world. Their most notable fan was Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte of France. Napoleon had been enchanted by the Ossian poems when he first read them in the 1780s. And the collected works was one of the books he brought with him on his military campaigns. His enthusiasm led to many French artists creating paintings based on the saga, and drove their translation into even more European languages. These paintings still hang in the French palaces where Napoleon lived. This is why the Irish name Oscar became a common European name. The man who Napoleon made King of Sweden named his son Oscar after a character from the epic. As a result, Oscar became a royal Swedish name and a popular name throughout the country. Other names from the epic also became common. Malvina, a modern Scandinavian name, originated in the stories. And while Fiona was a name in use before this, it went from being an obscure ancient Irish name to being a consistently popular girl's name throughout the English-speaking world. Places are named for the saga's heroes, including one of the counties that making up Ireland's capital, Fingal. It's been wildly influential, which makes it all the more surprising that it's all fake. In fact, it's been common knowledge almost since the poems were first published that they were not authentic ancient sagas, and that in fact James McPherson had made them up from whole cloth. Let's step back from that for the moment, though, and look at the historical relationship between Scotland and Ireland. Sometime before the 6th century, a group of Irish Celts invaded Scotland and formed the Kingdom of Dalriata on its west coast. Or at least, that's what the legends say. The Venerable Bede, a monk who was one of the first English historians, wrote that the kingdom was founded by an Irish Celt named Ruada, which could be his version of the Irish nickname for redheads, Ruad. Dal literally means portion, but in this context means the kingdom of, so the kingdom of Ruad is a reasonable origin. There could be Bede working backwards from that. He was writing in the 8th century about something that happened centuries earlier, after all. The most widely accepted version of the founding of Dalriata comes from the 11th century, and a poem named Duan Albanach, the Song of the Scots. We don't know who wrote it, we don't even know where it was written, but it was soon seized on as the national myth of the Scottish people. Lists the kings of Scotland going back to the founder of the kingdom, Fergus Mór, Big Fergus. The 8th century Book of Armagh mentions that Fergus Mór came from Ireland in the 5th century, conquered part of Britain, and died there. References to his son Domengark describe him as of Retty's kin, meaning some unknown clan that gave Dalriata its name. So the idea that the Scots came from Ireland became an accepted fact of Scottish history. But is that actually the case? The Scottish archaeologist Ewan Campbell first proposed in 2001 that the story of Scotland being founded by the Irish was a myth treated as fact. He pointed to a lack of archaeological evidence for a migration from Antrim to Argyll at that time, and to differences in brooches worn by Irish and Scottish nobles of the period, as indicating that Scottish Celts could just as easily have been a separate Celtic kingdom founded by immigration from the continent, just as Ireland had been. He also points to Duan Albanach being written under the reign of King Malcolm III, and explicitly referencing him at the end of his genealogy. As such, it could have been distorted as a way to connect him back to heroic founder, and give his rule legitimacy. Campbell does raise some interesting points. His most important one is that the narrative is shaping the history, and the few facts we have from the 5th century are being woven into a pre-existing tapestry. I'm not sure I agree with his argument. He is expressing a long-held view that Scotland didn't come from Ireland, or that Ireland was even founded by Scotland, but neither of those have ever had much historical substance to back them up. The mainstream view is still that the Scots originated in Ireland, but it does show how things are never as straightforward as people might think. Regardless of the truth, then, the idea that the Scots and the Irish were once one people was an accepted fact by the 18th century, although by then more than a sea separated them. In the grand Reformation of Christianity centuries earlier, the Irish had remained staunchly Catholic, while the Scottish had mostly embraced the Presbyterian faith of John Calvin. The settlement of Scots in Ulster by James I had heightened the division in one way, when land was taken from rebellious Irish Catholics and given to loyal Scottish Protestants. But this also strengthened the connection for many. They didn't regard this as an invasion, but as a reclamation of the land their ancestors had been driven out of by treachery a millennia before. This gave rise to a new culture, the Ulster Scots, and it meant that, regardless of the historical truth, there were now direct links between Ireland and Scotland, kinsmen across the water. This was the atmosphere where James McPherson began to weave a new legend, of a time when Scotland came to Ireland's aid in its hour of greatest need. James McPherson was born in 1736 as the son of a farmer in the Highlands of Scotland. His father was related to the chief of the McPherson clan, which lent him some status in the area. Young James grew up in tumultuous times, as the Jacobite rebellion broke out in Scotland when he was 9 years old. This was an attempt by Charles Edward Stuart to regain the throne of Britain. His grandfather, King James, had lost it to King William of Orange over 50 years earlier. The Stuarts were a Scottish house, claiming descent from Fergus More of Dalriada. So Charles began his campaign in Scotland. Riven, where young James McPherson grew up, was a barracks town for the surrounding lands, and so he witnessed soldiers marching out to fight for Bonnie Prince Charlie. Then he witnessed the English soldiers riding in and burning the barracks to the ground. In the end, the rebellion concluded with Charles thoroughly defeated, and with the Scottish nationalist movement which had backed him crushed. The Scottish clan system was outlawed, while London began a long campaign to make the Scots more British and less individually Scottish. All of this had an impact on young James and his view of the world. By 1752, things had calmed down considerably in Scotland, and James had shown enough promise and potential to be sent to King's College in Aberdeen. He spent 3 years in Aberdeen before moving on to spend a year at the University of Edinburgh. The Highland country boy developed a fierce pride in his heritage as a direct reaction to the contempt of his lowlander classmates. During this time, he began to write poetry, though with limited success. His epic poem, The Highlander, was a good representation of his mentality at the time. It tells of a Scottish hero named Alpin who fights to defend Scotland against Scandinavian invaders. The poem shows promise, but it's also very clearly the work of a rebellious teenage boy. In later years, James would even try to suppress it, as he was obviously ashamed of this initial foray into writing. James had been sent to university by his town in order to become a schoolmaster for them, and so when he completed his studies, he returned to Riven. He continued to write and submitted some poems to Scots magazine. It's notable that one of these was based on a work by the Roman poet Horace, though James was quite open in admitting his inspiration. The Highlander was published 2 years after his return to Riven, but unsurprisingly it failed to sell well. He wrote more and more and published less and less, clearly trying to find his voice. And then in 1759 he took a job as a tutor in the town of Moffat, where he met a playwright named John Home. John was a lowlander and had grown up speaking English, but he had a fascination with Gaelic and Gaelic literature. When he found out that James could speak Gaelic, he badgered him to translate some ancient Scottish poems for him. This was the beginning of it all. What James produced was The Death of Oscar, a long poem about two warriors named Diarmid and Oscar, who together slay a mighty warrior chief named Dargo. The poem is narrated by Oscar's father, Ossian. The two heroes both fall in love with Dargo's daughter, an unnamed warrior princess, but she only has eyes for Oscar. So Diarmid decides to die, But to avoid the stigma of suicide, he persuades Oscar to fight him in a duel that he knows he cannot win. With his best friend dead, Oscar is overcome by grief. He tricks the princess into shooting him during target practice and is buried next to his friend. Here's an excerpt from the poem. Blessed be that hand of snow, and blessed thy bow of yew. I fall resolved on death, and who but the daughter of Dargo was worthy to slay me? Lay me in the earth, my fair one. Lay me by the side of Diarmid. This is where the controversy begins. James never revealed his original sources, so the question of whether he was actually translating 3rd century Scottish poetry or whether he was writing it himself remains open. There's honestly no way to be sure in this case. The poem bore a great deal of resemblance to The Highlander, and even references a character who appears in it. But the skill of the translator is the heart of the translation, and it would be natural for James to draw on his knowledge of old tales for his own poetry as well. No folklorist has ever found the original version of the poem, though. So the most common interpretation is that James took an old story, and using it as a frame, wrote the poem upon it. Not the most dishonest thing to do, but not what he was claiming it to be either. Regardless, it's an overwrought and incredibly melodramatic piece of nonsense, so naturally John Home and his friends loved it. They begged James to give them more translations of these Highlander poems, and so eventually he did. If James had lied about Oscar's provenance, he was now caught in his own cleft stick. The poem was a runaway success, but he was now expected to produce more such marvels. He obliged in a trickle that circulated privately in Edinburgh, before being collected and sold as Fragments of Ancient Poetry in 1761. Even if Oscar was based on some semblance of real Gaelic folklore, the majority of the rest of them were not. The book was released at the urging of James's new friend Hugh Blair, a professor at the University of Edinburgh. Hugh was a professor of belles lettres, literally beautiful writing. He saw James's poems as proof of the pure Celtic heritage of the Scottish people, and both felt that, like the other ancient peoples, the Scottish deserved their own epic poem. Surely the works of the great Ossian, author of most of the poems James had found, contained such an epic. James hinted at it in the foreword of Fragments. The following year he published Fingal, the poem that would take his work to the next level. Quote, As rushes a stream of foam from the dark shady deep of Cromla, when the thunder is travelling above, and dark brown night sits on half the hill, through the breaches of the tempest look forth the dim faces of ghosts, so fierce, so vast, so terrible, rushed on the sons of Erin. McPherson might not have been the most honest man, but he was still a pretty good writer. Though it might have been a fake, Fingal is a masterpiece. It tells of how Ireland was invaded by Ciaran, the king of Lochlan. Lochlan was the Gaelic word for Scandinavia, though it had originally been the legendary homeland of the Fomorians. The Irish hero Cuchulainn, general of the High King's army, is unsure if he can hold out against the invaders. Then he receives word that Fingal, king of the Celts who had settled in Scotland, will send aid. He rallies his men to stand against the invaders. Many heroes die in the fighting, and the ghost of one returns to tell Cuchulainn that he will be defeated if the fighting continues. Shortly thereafter, a messenger arrives seeking his surrender. Take Ciaran's peace, the warrior spoke, the peace that he gives to kings when nations bow to his sword. Leave Erin's streamy plains to us, and give thy spouse and dog. Thy spouse, high-bosomed, heaving fair, thy dog that overtakes the wind. Give these to prove the weakness of thine arm. Live then beneath our power. Cuchulainn replies, Tell Ciaran, tell that heart of pride. Cuchulainn never yields. I give him the dark rolling sea. I give his people graves in Erin. But never shall a stranger have the pleasing sunbeam of my love. No deer shall fly on Lochlan's hills before swift-footed Lugh. As it was foretold, despite his courage, Cuchulainn is defeated. But as he flees the battlefield, he spies Fingal's fleet coming from Scotland on the horizon. Fingal's forces arrive in time to save the Irishmen from being wiped out. With Fingal comes his son Ossian and his grandson Oscar. Ossian is a bard, he is blind, and he is the narrator of the epic. One night between battles he is visited by the ghost of Oscar's mother, who warns him in time to rescue Oscar from an unexpected ambush. In the final battle, Fingal defeats the Lochlanach, but the heroism of one of their chieftains persuades him not to have his men pursue and destroy them. He does capture Ciaran, the leader of the invaders. Two men have some history. Fingal had loved Ciaran's sister Agandeca before she died tragically. A bard at the victory feast sings of the distant common ancestry of the two kings. And as a result, Fingal releases Ciaran and is promised to never again invade Ireland. Fingal and Cuchulainn discuss the war before Fingal leaves and returns home to Scotland. Quote, "Thus the night passed away in song. We brought back the morning with joy. Fingal arose in the heath and shook his glittering spear. He moved first towards the plains of Lena. We followed in all our arms. Spread the sail, said the king. Seize the winds as they pour from Lena. We rose on the wave with songs. We rushed with joy through the foam of the deep." Thus ends the epic, and the alarm bells should already be ringing for students of Irish mythology. Not only does the name Cuchulainn seem extremely similar to Cuchulainn, but Fingal also sounds very close to Finn, and a hero named Finn with a son named Ossian and a grandson named Oscar is more than a coincidence. A battle against Scandinavian invaders is also deeply anachronistic for the type of ancient Celtic story he is claiming to be translating. There is no other source for this story than McPherson, and no parallel in any other myth. The poem is a well-written piece of work that deserves to be praised, but there are definite issues in accepting it as a genuine ancient legend. None of that mattered at the time, though, and the poem was a huge success. It was published in 1762, the same year that McPherson's work was first translated and published on the continent. The following year, another epic poem allegedly by Ossian was released by McPherson. It was called Temora, which in the poem is the name for the royal palace of Ireland. Of course, this name is given in no other source. The palace is the site of Ilney, where Cairbear of the Firbolg murders the true king and seizes power. Fingal invades Ireland once more to dethrone the usurper and restore his kinsmen to power. Cairbear invites Oscar, who was in Ireland at the time, to a feast in order to force him into a duel and kill him before he can join his father and grandfather. Both men receive mortal wounds in the duel. Cairbear's brother Cathmore takes his place as King of Ireland. The rest of the poem is an alternating series of battles between the armies and intrigue in the palace in between. For example, a princess named Solmala has disguised herself as a man and followed Cathmore to war. He discovers her secret, but allows her to remain, and the two become lovers. Ossian's brother Fillan distinguishes himself as a great hero and dies a hero's death. Fillan's ghost appears to Fingal and tells him to take to the field of battle, which he does after sending a group of heroes to rescue the last remaining legitimate Irish heir. In the battle, Fingal kills Cathmore, and the Firbolg are routed. With the rightful heir restored, once again Fingal returns home to Scotland. From the very beginning, people were not shy in their doubts of the poems being authentic. One of the most vocal was Charles O'Connor, the greatest Irish historian of the 18th century. O'Connor was born in 1710 in County Sligo. He was a descendant of the O'Connors who were once the kings of Connacht. His mother's side was equally illustrious. Her mother was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary, the second wife of King James I, and her father was an Irish count who died fighting for the Holy Roman Emperor. Charles O'Connor's family were Gaelic history incarnate, and from an early age it was his passion. He married the daughter of a rich merchant, and being now independently wealthy, he was able to throw himself into history. In 1753, he published Dissertations on the Ancient History of Ireland, based on his close study of the Irish manuscripts he had collected and the work of previous historians. His devotion to academic rigour won him a famous admirer, Samuel Johnson, possibly the greatest scholar in English history. In 1766, O'Connor released a revised and updated version of his dissertations, and one of the things he added was a thoroughly researched rebuttal of McPherson's work. Samuel Johnson himself also laid into McPherson in his 1775 travelogue, A Journey to the Western Isles of Scotland. O'Connor published his own book about the origins of the ancient Scots the same year. Between them, they thoroughly convinced all serious scholars and most of the general public that McPherson's poems were at best based on fragments of true legends woven together with invention, and at worst were fabricated from beginning to end. The only ones who held out against this were those in the Western Scottish and Ulster Scots communities, who felt that McPherson's poems lent the plantation of Ulster an air of legitimacy and historical precedent, easing the conscience of those who cared. Despite the general consensus that the poems were fake, they were still very well written and continue to be popular. A lie can get around the world before the truth gets its boots on, as Terry Pratchett once wrote. The Ossian Saga was translated into multiple European languages and had a profound influence on the budding Romantic movement. This was the era of the Enlightenment, when rational philosophy had come to dominate European culture. Romanticism was a reaction to that, a belief that imagination and a subjective interpretation of beauty were vital for the health of the soul. To these artists, it didn't really matter if the Ossian Saga was true or not, it just mattered that it was beautiful. The Romantics championed the ideas of an earlier time, and the honest passions of the pseudo-Celtic heroes McPherson had created meshed perfectly with their beliefs. In The Sorrows of Young Werther, one of his most successful early novels, Goethe has his hero recite a translation of a passage from Ossian at the emotional climax of the story. Johann Herder also cited Ossian in his manifesto for the Sturm und Drang movement, the precursor to the Romantics. Melchior Cesarotti's Italian translation, published in 1772, was widely read in both Italy and France. This was the version that Napoleon read, which, as we've said, led to many of his artistic subjects taking inspiration from the works to curry favour. Artists were painting scenes from McPherson long before the Corsican corporal took the emperor's throne, though. In 1782, Nikolai Abelgard painted Ossian playing the harp, for example. And it wasn't just painters who took inspiration from it. Johann Brahms set a part of the poem to music in 1860, and Niels Wilhelm Gade made his debut as a composer in 1841 with an overture, Echoes of Ossian. Franz Schubert wrote 11 songs inspired by the Ossian Saga. It may have been fake, but it heavily influenced how the artistic community saw Gaelic and Celtic culture throughout the 19th century. Which leads us to the Irish literary revival. This was a subset of the Celtic revival, which was focused on bringing back the Irish cultural legacy that had been ground away by centuries of colonial rule. The movement is often associated with W.B. Yeats, but he was only one of the leading lights of a great many men and women who decided that their heritage was something worth caring about. In order to recreate that Irishness that had been lost, they drew on folklore and history. The works of Charles O'Connor were key to this movement. He had been a lone thread tied back to the past a century before, but now that thread had multiplied. Plays like The Last Feast of the Fianna and Yeats' Celtic Twilight all drew these threads into a tapestry together. But one of those threads, woven into the fabric of Irishness, was undoubtedly Ossian. It was too ingrained in the romantic vision of Ireland to be left out. The retellings of Irish myth that the movement published drew on over a century of romantic traditions. Whether consciously or not, McPherson's voice echoes in those tales. So then, what is history? History is the truth, when it can be. But history is also a spectrum, with the scholarly rigour of Charles O'Connor at one side, and the poetic inspiration of James McPherson at the other. The history that lives in our bones, that resonates from ancestors, is forged not just of what actually happened, but also of how we feel about it. McPherson's invention was a lie, and it could never become the truth. But it might have become real. This has been Wild Old Times, a podcast about the stranger corners of Ireland and Irish history. The opening theme is The Cat That Ate the Candle. The closing theme is The Parting Glass. Both were recorded by Gregory Mahan and are used under a Creative Commons license. You can find more of Greg's music at tinwhistler.com. Our logo is by Liffy Designs. Wild Old Times is recorded at Farset Labs in Belfast. If you enjoyed the podcast, give it a review wherever you find it. It really does help the show. If you really enjoyed it, tell your friends. Either way, I hope to see you again for another wild old time from Irish history.